Major William Bradford stood in the map room of Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force in London during the cold evening of May 15, 1944, studying the intelligence reports that documented every German defensive position along the Normandy coastline with a precision that would have seemed impossible just 2 years earlier, when Allied planning for the invasion of occupied Europe first began in earnest. The responsibility weighing on Bradford and thousands of other officers working on Operation Overlord extended far beyond personal survival or even individual unit success, encompassing nothing less than the liberation of Western Europe from Nazi occupation, and the potential prevention of millions more deaths that would occur if Germany could not be defeated, before developing new weapons that intelligence agencies warned were under development in secret facilities across the Reich. The maps covering the walls showed 5 designated beach sectors stretching across 50 miles of Norman coast, each marked with detailed notations about German strongpoints, obstacle belts, minefields, and the defensive units that would attempt to drive any invasion force back into the English Channel before beachheads could be established and reinforced. Bradford's specific role in the invasion planning focused on the deception operations that would convince German commanders the main Allied assault would strike the Pas-de-Calais region rather than Normandy, creating strategic confusion that would delay German reinforcement of the actual invasion beaches and potentially making the difference between success and catastrophic failure. The strategic situation that had led to this moment involved calculations that balanced military necessity against political constraints and operational feasibility in ways that tested the Allied coalition's ability to coordinate across national interests and competing strategic visions. The Soviet Union had been bearing the primary burden of fighting Nazi Germany since June 1941, when Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, with Soviet casualties measured in millions, while Western Allied forces fought comparatively limited campaigns in North Africa and Italy that diverted only a fraction of German military power from the Eastern Front. Stalin's repeated demands for a second front in Western Europe reflected both military necessity and political concern that the Soviet Union was being left to bleed, while Britain and America delayed the decisive confrontation that would determine Europe's future. But the Western Allied commanders understood through painful experience at Dieppe in 1942 that premature amphibious assault against prepared German defenses would result in slaughter of the attacking forces without achieving lodgment, making careful preparation and overwhelming force concentration necessary prerequisites for any invasion attempt. The selection of Normandy as the invasion site rather than the more obvious Pas-de-Calais reflected sophisticated analysis of German defensive preparations, transportation networks needed to support operations after landing, and deception opportunities that could be exploited to mislead German intelligence about Allied intentions. Bradford had joined the planning staff in early 1943 after previous service as intelligence officer with forces fighting in North Africa. His experience analyzing German tactical capabilities and his understanding of how intelligence shaped operational decisions making him valuable contributor to the team designing the deception plan that would become Operation Fortitude. The complexity of creating convincing deception that would survive scrutiny from German intelligence services required coordination across multiple domains, including physical deployments that German reconnaissance could observe, communications patterns that German signals intelligence would intercept, and controlled information leaks through double agents who fed German intelligence reports that confirmed their existing assumptions about where and when the invasion would occur. The fundamental principle underlying Fortitude was to reinforce what German commanders already believed, rather than trying to convince them of something completely contrary to their analysis, exploiting the natural human tendency to seek information, confirming pre-existing beliefs while discounting contradictory evidence. German military doctrine and geographic analysis suggested that any major Allied invasion would strike at the Pas-de-Calais, where the English Channel was narrowest and where success would provide most direct route to Germany's industrial heartland, making this the obvious target that German forces were preparing most heavily to defend. Bradford's task was to create and maintain the illusion that a massive Allied army group was assembling in southeastern England, preparing to invade Pas-de-Calais, using every available method to make this fictional force appear real to German intelligence, while the actual invasion forces prepared in southern England for the Normandy assault. The deception architecture that Bradford helped construct involved layers of reinforcing elements that created consistent picture across all intelligence sources that German analysts would examine. Physical deception included positioning dummy landing craft and inflatable tanks in locations where German reconnaissance aircraft could photograph them, creating appearance of major force concentration in southeastern England. The dummy equipment was manufactured with attention to detail that would survive aerial observation, with inflatable tanks including features like track marks and vehicle spacing that matched actual military deployments. Radio deception involved generating communications traffic that simulated the patterns associated with large military formations, with signal units broadcasting messages using call signs and procedures that suggested the presence of divisions and corps that existed only in German intelligence assessments. The controlled information flowing through double agents represented perhaps the most delicate aspect of the deception, requiring careful management of what information was passed to ensure that it appeared valuable enough to be credible while actually reinforcing the deception narrative. Bradford worked with counterintelligence services that had identified and turned German agents operating in Britain, using these controlled channels to feed information about the fictional army group and its apparent preparations for Pas-de-Calais invasion. The operational security measures protecting actual invasion preparations were equally important to the deception efforts, with extensive controls designed to prevent any leak of information that could reveal Normandy as the real target. The entire invasion force was isolated in sealed camps during the final weeks before D-Day, with no communications permitted outside military channels and with movement restrictions preventing anyone from leaving the camps where knowledge of the invasion details existed. The restriction on communications created hardship for soldiers who wanted to contact families before entering combat, but the security requirements were absolute given that even small information leaks could compromise the entire operation if German intelligence pieced together indications that Normandy was the actual target. The diplomatic traffic from neutral embassies in London was monitored to ensure that no information about invasion preparations leaked through diplomatic channels that German intelligence was known to monitor. Even senior Allied officers not directly involved in Overlord planning were denied information about the invasion timing and location, the compartmentalization of knowledge being necessary to prevent inadvertent disclosure through casual conversation or through captured documents if officers with knowledge were taken prisoner. The technical innovation that characterized Allied preparations for Overlord extended beyond deception operations to include development of specialized equipment that would be needed to overcome German beach defenses that intelligence assessments indicated were formidable and growing stronger with each month that invasion was delayed. German engineers had constructed complex obstacle systems designed to destroy or disable landing craft attempting to reach the beaches, including steel hedgehogs that would rip open hulls of vessels that struck them, wooden posts topped with mines that would detonate against boats, and concrete barriers that would prevent vehicles from moving inland even if troops managed to get ashore. The Allied response required innovation across multiple areas, including modified tanks that could swim to shore using flotation devices and provide fire support from the moment they landed, specialized engineer vehicles that could clear obstacles under fire using explosive charges or mechanical flails that detonated mines through beating the ground with heavy chains, and assault bridges that could be rapidly deployed to cross anti-tank ditches or sea walls that would otherwise stop vehicle movement. Bradford observed the testing of these specialized vehicles at training facilities where beach conditions were simulated and where soldiers practiced the assault techniques that would be needed on D-Day, his intelligence background making him appreciate how essential these technical solutions were to overcoming the defensive advantages that German positions enjoyed. The air campaign that supported Overlord preparations involved systematic attacks on French transportation infrastructure designed to make German reinforcement of Normandy difficult after invasion began, with bridges and rail yards being destroyed across northern France in patterns that would not reveal which coastal sector was the actual invasion target. The bombing campaign was controversial because attacks on transportation networks inevitably caused French civilian casualties, creating tension between military necessity and humanitarian concerns about killing the people the Allies were ostensibly trying to liberate. Bradford wrestled with these ethical questions while recognizing that invasion success required degrading German ability to move reinforcements quickly to wherever the landing occurred, making the transportation attacks necessary despite their costs. The targeting was designed to create transportation difficulties across wide area of northern France, rather than focusing exclusively on approaches to Normandy. This pattern supporting the deception narrative by suggesting that Allies were preparing multiple invasion options rather than committing to single location. The air superiority that Allied forces enjoyed over France by spring 1944 reflected sustained campaign against the Luftwaffe that had destroyed German air power through combination of bomber offensives that forced German fighters to defend against attacks on Germany itself, and fighter sweeps that destroyed German aircraft in air-to-air combat when they attempted to intercept Allied bombers. The naval planning for Operation Overlord presented challenges that exceeded anything previously attempted in military history, with the requirement to transport over 150,000 troops across the English Channel on the first day alone, demanding coordination of more than 5,000 ships and landing craft, organized into task forces that would deliver soldiers to their assigned beach sectors at precisely calculated times. Bradford attended planning conferences where naval officers presented schedules showing how vessels departing from ports across southern England would converge in the Channel and arrive at Normandy beaches in sequences timed to support the tactical plan. Each landing craft assigned specific cargo and arrival time that fit into larger scheme of building combat power ashore, faster than German reinforcements could arrive to contest the beachheads. The complexity of this naval choreography required accounting for tides and currents that would affect landing craft navigation, for the timing of naval gunfire support that would suppress German positions during the assault, and for the sequencing of different types of units from assault infantry, who would storm the beaches first to follow on forces bringing heavy equipment and supplies needed to sustain operations inland. The margin for error was minimal, given that delays or confusion in the landing sequence could create congestion on beaches that would make units vulnerable to German artillery fire, while landing too quickly without proper fire support could send troops into killing zones where German positions had not been adequately suppressed. Bradford's contribution to naval planning focused on ensuring that deception operations would not interfere with the actual invasion fleet's movements, while continuing to suggest to German intelligence that the Normandy operation was diversionary attack preceding the main assault at Pas de Calais. This required careful timing of deception activities to create impression that the fictional army group remained in southeastern England, preparing for its own invasion even after the Normandy landings began, exploiting German tendency to see what they expected rather than adapting quickly to evidence that contradicted their preconceptions. The double agents controlled by British intelligence would report after D-Day that the Normandy assault was exactly the diversion that German intelligence had been warned to expect, reinforcing German hesitation about committing strategic reserves to counterattack beaches when the agents' reports suggested the real invasion was still coming at Pas de Calais. Bradford understood that this extended deception could buy crucial days during which Allied forces could consolidate beachheads and build up strength to resist German counterattacks. The delay in German commitment of panzer divisions potentially making difference between Allied lodgment and disaster that would set back any second invasion attempt by months or years. The airborne operations that would precede the beach landings represented another dimension of the complex plan that sought to overwhelm German defensive capabilities through simultaneous attacks from multiple directions that would create confusion and prevent coordinated response. 3 Allied airborne divisions would be dropped or landed by glider behind the invasion beaches during darkness before dawn, their missions including securing key bridges and road junctions that German reinforcements would need to use, destroying coastal batteries that could fire on landing beaches, and creating general chaos in German rear areas that would slow enemy reaction to the seaborne assault. Bradford reviewed intelligence on German defenses in the airborne drop zones, identifying anti-aircraft positions and defensive units that would threaten the transport aircraft and the paratroopers once they landed. This information being used to plan routes that would minimize aircraft losses while still delivering forces to their objectives. The inherent risks of airborne operations were substantial, with transport aircraft vulnerable to ground fire and with paratroopers likely to be scattered by winds and navigation errors that would disperse them across wide areas, rather than concentrating them at intended drop zones. But the potential benefits of disrupting German defensive coordination justified accepting these risks as necessary cost of invasion success. Bradford spent the final days before D-Day reviewing intelligence reports for any indication that German forces had detected invasion preparations or that deception operations had failed to convince German commanders about Pas-de-Calais being the primary target. The intelligence flowing from German communications intercepts and from agents operating in occupied France suggested that deception was succeeding, with German defensive preparations continuing to focus on Pas-de-Calais, while Normandy sectors received relatively less attention despite intelligence indicating some Allied interest in the region. The German command structure in France was divided between different authorities, with Field Marshal Rommel commanding forces directly defending coast, while armored reserves remained under separate control, requiring authorization from Hitler himself before they could be committed to counterattack. This command confusion working to Allied advantage by making rapid German response more difficult, even after invasion location became clear. Bradford felt cautiously optimistic that deception had created conditions where Allied forces would face German coastal defenders without immediate reinforcement by mobile reserves, buying time needed to establish secure beachheads before German armor could reach the coast in strength. The human dimension of the invasion preparations weighed on Bradford as he observed final briefings where soldiers learned details of their missions and received last instructions before boarding ships that would carry them to France. The young faces showing mixture of determination and fear reminded Bradford that the operational plans he had helped develop would be executed by individuals who would experience terror and chaos of combat regardless of how carefully headquarters staff had planned the operation. The statistical projections of casualties that planners use to calculate medical requirements and replacement needs translated into these specific soldiers who would be killed or wounded during the assault, their individual fates depending on countless variables from the accuracy of German defensive fire to pure chance of being in wrong place when shell exploded or machine gun burst swept across their landing craft. Bradford felt responsibility that extended beyond purely professional obligation, recognizing that the success or failure of deception operations he had worked on for months would directly affect how many of these soldiers survived the invasion, and whether the operation succeeded in establishing foothold that could be expanded into full liberation of occupied Europe. The meteorological conditions that would determine whether invasion proceeded on schedule or had to be postponed represented factor beyond Allied control that created enormous tension during final days before planned D-Day of June 5th. The invasion required specific combination of tide conditions, moonlight for airborne operations, and weather suitable for naval operations and air support. These requirements creating narrow windows when invasion could occur, with tide and moon conditions repeating only at monthly intervals. The weather forecast for early June showed developing storm system that would make channel crossing dangerous, and that would prevent air operations supporting the assault, forcing Supreme Commander Eisenhower to make agonizing decision to delay invasion by 24 hours despite the risks that postponement created, including potential compromise of operational security, if soldiers who had already been briefed and loaded aboard ships were returned to ports. Bradford was present at headquarters when weather forecasters presented updated predictions showing brief improvement in conditions on June 6th that would allow invasion to proceed if Eisenhower accepted the marginal conditions. The Supreme Commander's decision to launch the operation despite imperfect weather, demonstrating the leadership under uncertainty that the situation demanded. You now understand that D-Day's success began not with soldiers hitting beaches, but with months of planning that anticipated every German move and created deceptions that paralyzed their response. The fictional army that never existed kept real German panzer divisions frozen at Pas-de-Calais, while Allied troops fought to establish beachheads in Normandy. The victory of imagination and intelligence over steel and concrete. Subscribe to this channel because we reveal how wars are won through planning and deception, rather than just firepower, showing you the invisible battles fought in map rooms and through radio signals that determined visible outcomes on battlefields. Comment below about which intelligence operation from World War II fascinates you most, whether it's Operation Fortitude, the breaking of Enigma codes, or the spy networks operating across occupied Europe. Tell us what aspects of military deception and intelligence warfare you want explored in future videos. The final intelligence briefing that Bradford attended on the evening of June 5th synthesized information from all sources about German defensive preparations and likely responses to invasion, providing commanders with assessment of what Allied forces would face when they hit the beaches at dawn. The intelligence picture showed German defensive positions concentrated along the coast with varying strength across different sectors, the fortifications at Omaha Beach being particularly formidable, with positions on heights overlooking the landing area, providing defenders with commanding fields of fire that would make the assault extremely difficult. The German divisions defending Normandy included static units composed partly of older soldiers and foreign volunteers, whose combat effectiveness was questionable, but the presence of veteran formations, including the 352nd Infantry Division at Omaha Beach, meant that assault forces would encounter determined resistance from experienced troops, rather than the weaker opposition that optimistic assessments had predicted. Bradford's briefing emphasized that deception operations had succeeded in creating strategic confusion about invasion location, but warned that once assault began, German forces would fight effectively, regardless of whether higher command believed Normandy was main attack or diversion, making the initial hours of the invasion critical for establishing foothold before German tactical response could organize. The launch of the invasion during early hours of June 6 proceeded according to plan, despite marginal weather conditions that made channel crossing uncomfortable for troops packed into landing craft, and that created rough seas affecting the swimming tanks that were supposed to provide fire support from the moment assault waves hit the beaches. Bradford remained at headquarters monitoring reports flowing back from the invasion force, the fragmentary information arriving through radio channels providing incomplete picture of how operations were developing across the 5 beach sectors, where British, Canadian, and American forces were attempting to fight their way inland against German defenses. The airborne operations had achieved their primary objective of disrupting German response, despite scattering paratroopers across wide areas, and despite glider landings that placed some units directly on top of German positions where immediate firefights erupted. The confusion created in German rear areas making it difficult for German commanders to understand what was happening and where main threats were developing. The beach landings showed varying results across different sectors, with British and Canadian forces at Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches making progress against resistance that was heavy, but not overwhelming, while American forces at Utah Beach succeeded partly through accidental landing away from heaviest German defenses. But Omaha Beach was becoming catastrophe, where casualties were mounting and assault waves were pinned down on the beach, unable to advance inland. Bradford's focus remained on monitoring German response to determine whether deception operations were continuing to affect German decisions about committing reserves to counterattack the beachheads. The intelligence intercepts during June 6 showed German commanders requesting permission to move armored divisions toward Normandy, while higher command hesitated, apparently still uncertain whether this was main invasion or elaborate diversion preceding larger assault elsewhere. The delay in German commitment of panzer divisions provided exactly the time that Allied planners had hoped deception would create, allowing assault forces to expand beachheads and begin landing reinforcements and heavy equipment that would be needed to resist armored counterattacks when they eventually came. Bradford observed that even when German High Command authorized movement of reserves toward Normandy, the transportation difficulties created by months of Allied bombing and the devastating attacks by Allied aircraft on German columns attempting to move during daylight hours meant that panzer divisions required days to reach the invasion area rather than the hours that rapid response would have required. The combination of strategic deception, creating hesitation, and tactical air power, destroying units attempting to move, had effectively paralyzed German ability to launch the immediate overwhelming counterattack that could have driven Allied forces back into the sea before beachheads were consolidated. The reports from Omaha Beach during the morning of June 6 created crisis atmosphere at headquarters, where senior commanders considered whether the landing at that sector had failed and whether forces should be diverted to other beaches, rather than continuing to reinforce what appeared to be disaster. Bradford reviewed intelligence about German defenses at Omaha that explained why casualties were so heavy. The combination of positions on heights overlooking beach and the presence of veteran German infantry division creating killing zone where American assault troops were being slaughtered as they attempted to cross the open beach. The situation was saved partly by naval destroyers moving close to shore to provide direct fire support against German positions, and partly by small groups of soldiers who found ways off the beach and began attacking German positions from flanks, their localized successes gradually accumulating into general breakthrough that allowed follow-on waves to land and move inland. The near disaster at Omaha demonstrated how even the most careful planning could not eliminate friction and unpredictability of combat operations, where small factors like specific German units being in unexpected positions could threaten entire operation, while also showing how determination and tactical skill at small unit level could overcome situations that seemed hopeless when viewed from higher command perspective. The German confusion about whether Normandy represented main invasion or diversion persisted through the critical first days when Allied forces were most vulnerable to counterattack by concentrated armor, the effectiveness of fortitude deception exceeding what even optimistic assessments had predicted. Bradford monitored reports from double agents who were feeding German intelligence information, suggesting that Normandy landings were preliminary operation, and that main assault would strike Pas-de-Calais within days. These reports apparently being believed by German intelligence analysts who continued warning their commanders about the expected second invasion. The result was that substantial German forces remained positioned to defend Pas-de-Calais region rather than being available to reinforce Normandy, including panzer divisions that were held back from commitment because German high command feared they would be needed for the real invasion that intelligence reports suggested was imminent. This strategic paralysis created by deception gave Allied forces several days to consolidate beachheads and begin building up combat power that would be needed to resist German counterattacks once they finally developed in strength. The engineering operations that cleared beach obstacles and established routes inland during first days after invasion demonstrated the importance of specialized equipment and training that Allied forces had developed specifically for this operation. The modified tanks and engineer vehicles that British and Canadian forces employed at their beaches allowed relatively quick clearance of obstacles and rapid movement off the beaches, reducing congestion and casualties compared to what occurred at Omaha Beach, where American forces had declined most of the specialized equipment and attempted to clear obstacles using more conventional methods. Bradford observed in after-action reports that the specialized equipment had proven its value and that American decision to forego most of these capabilities had contributed to difficulties at Omaha, though American commanders argued that their troops' fighting spirit rather than specialized equipment deserved credit for eventual success. The debate about whether technology or human factors were more important to combat success would continue, but Bradford's assessment was that both were necessary and that specialized equipment had reduced casualties while increasing speed of operations at beaches where it was employed effectively. The expansion of Allied beachheads during the week following D-Day proceeded against German resistance that varied from sector to sector, depending on terrain, and on which German units were defending specific areas. the fighting developing into pattern, where Allied forces made steady progress measured in fields and villages, rather than dramatic breakthroughs that would have indicated collapse of German defensive system. Bradford's intelligence work shifted to assessing German reinforcement patterns and identifying which units were moving toward Normandy, and when they would arrive, this information being critical for Allied commanders planning offensive operations that would need to succeed before German strength built up to levels where continued Allied advance would become impossible. The intelligence picture showed German forces struggling to move reinforcements through transportation network that had been systematically destroyed by months of Allied bombing, with bridges out and rail lines cut, forcing German units to use circuitous routes that extended their travel time while exposing them to constant air attack when they attempted to move during daylight. The German armored divisions that did reach Normandy arrived piecemeal rather than concentrated, their strength being fed into battle in increments that allowed Allied forces to engage them sequentially, rather than facing overwhelming massed armor that could have broken through Allied lines. The battle for Caen that developed during June became a attritional struggle where British and Canadian forces attempted repeatedly to capture the city that was critical objective for D-Day itself, but which German defenders held with determination that reflected the importance they assigned to preventing Allied breakout from the beachhead. Bradford analyzed intelligence about German forces defending Caen, including several SS Panzer divisions that fought with fanatical commitment, despite taking heavy casualties from Allied artillery and airstrikes. The attrition of German armor in these battles serving strategic purpose, even though failure to capture Caen quickly was disappointing to Allied commanders, who had hoped for more rapid progress. The concentration of German armor at Caen meant these forces were not available to contest American advance in western sectors, where terrain was more suitable for eventual breakout operation that would transform static battle for beachhead into mobile warfare, where Allied advantages in air power and numbers could be decisive. Bradford's assessment was that while battles around Caen appeared to be frustrating stalemate, they were actually achieving strategic effect by destroying German mobile reserves through attrition, while fixing them in position where they could not interfere with American preparations for breakout. The logistical achievement of supporting Allied operations in Normandy exceeded the capacity of the port facilities available to Allied forces, requiring massive over-the-beach operations using the Mulberry artificial harbors that had been towed across channel and assembled off the invasion beaches. Bradford visited the Mulberry harbor supporting British operations and observed the steady stream of ships unloading supplies and equipment directly onto the artificial piers, the engineering sophistication of these structures demonstrating the level of innovation that Allied industrial capacity could produce when given adequate time and resources for development. The destruction of American Mulberry by severe storm in mid-June created temporary logistics crisis that was resolved partly through continued over-the-beach operations and partly through intensified efforts to capture and restore port of Cherbourg, the German demolitions at Cherbourg being so extensive that weeks of engineer work were required before the port could handle significant cargo, despite its capture occurring in late June. The logistics constraints imposed by limited port capacity affected operational planning throughout June and July, with attacks sometimes being delayed because ammunition stockpiles needed to be built up before offensives could be launched, and with reinforcements arriving more slowly than tactical situation demanded. The effectiveness of Allied air power in isolating the Normandy battlefield and preventing German reinforcement became increasingly apparent as the campaign developed, with German units attempting to move toward the fighting during daylight being destroyed or dispersed by fighter bombers that attacked anything moving on roads leading to the battle area. Bradford received reports from pilots describing the destruction they inflicted on German columns caught in the open without air cover, the accounts of vehicles burning and soldiers scattered across fields, demonstrating how completely Allied air superiority affected German operational mobility. The German response was to attempt movement only at night or in small groups that could take cover when aircraft appeared. This adaptation, reducing their losses but also slowing reinforcement to crawl, that allowed Allied buildup to proceed faster than German forces could match. The psychological impact of constant air attack on German morale was significant beyond the physical destruction, with German soldiers learning that movement meant death and that attempting to concentrate forces for counterattacks would draw devastating airstrikes before attacks could be launched. The bocage terrain in the American sector created tactical challenges that slowed operations and increased casualties as infantry fought through landscape of small fields, surrounded by ancient earthen banks topped with thick hedgerows that provided natural defensive positions favoring German defenders. Bradford reviewed after-action reports describing the difficulty of advancing through bocage, where visibility was limited, and where German positions could not be identified until attackers were at close range. The fighting requiring small unit infantry tactics and taking toll in casualties that mounted steadily despite the grinding progress that eventually pushed German forces back. The development of improvised hedgerow cutters that allowed American tanks to push through the earthen banks rather than climbing over them where they exposed vulnerable belly armor represented exactly the type of field innovation that Bradford appreciated, with soldiers identifying tactical problem and creating solution using available materials rather than waiting for higher command to provide specialized equipment. The cumulative effect of these small innovations and tactical adaptations was gradual improvement in American ability to fight effectively in bocage terrain, though the inherent advantages that terrain provided to defenders meant that progress remained slow and costly throughout June and early July. The strategic deception that had been so critical to D-Day success continued affecting German decisions well into July, as the fictional 1st U.S. Army Group supposedly remained in England, preparing for follow-on invasion that German intelligence still expected, despite the obvious commitment of major forces to Normandy battle. Bradford's deception work during this period focused on maintaining believability of the Phantom Army Group through continued radio traffic and through information fed via double agents, the extended effectiveness of the deception, demonstrating how thoroughly German intelligence had been penetrated and how successfully Allied deception specialists had exploited German cognitive biases and preconceptions. The eventual recognition by German high command that no second invasion was coming at Pas-de-Calais freed German forces for commitment to Normandy. But by that time, Allied beachheads were solidly established, and the opportunity for German counteroffensive that might have driven Allies back into the sea had passed, the strategic window that deception had created having been successfully exploited by Allied forces to establish irreversible lodgment on the continent. The breakout from Normandy that finally occurred in late July through Operation Cobra demonstrated how the attritional fighting during June and early July had set conditions for decisive maneuver by destroying German mobile reserves and by fixing remaining German forces in positions where American armored exploitation could penetrate into rear areas before defenders could respond effectively. Bradford's intelligence preparation for Cobra involved identifying weakened sectors of German line where concentrated American attack using massive air bombardment followed by armor exploitation would have best chance of achieving clean breakthrough, the targeting reflecting months of analyzing German defensive patterns and identifying vulnerabilities that could be exploited by forces strong enough to overwhelm local defenses before reinforcements could arrive. The execution of Cobra involved risks including the heavy bombing that caused friendly casualties when aircraft dropped ordnance short of intended targets, but the massive firepower concentrated on narrow front achieved the breakthrough that more cautious approaches had failed to produce during previous operations. Bradford monitored reports of American armored divisions pouring through the breach and advancing rapidly into Brittany and toward interior of France. The mobile warfare that developed after Cobra, representing exactly the type of operation where Allied advantages in air power and mechanization could be decisive against German forces that lacked fuel for sustained mobile operations and that could not maneuver without being attacked by omnipresent Allied aircraft. The German response to Cobra breakthrough was delayed and inadequate, partly because the sudden transformation from static positional warfare to rapid mobile operations caught German commanders unprepared, and partly because the transportation and logistics difficulties that had plagued German operations throughout the campaign prevented rapid concentration of forces needed for effective counterattack. Bradford's intelligence showed Germany attempting to organize counteroffensive aimed at cutting off American spearheads and restoring defensive line, but the attack when it finally came at Mortain in early August was too weak and too late to achieve its objectives. American forces stopping the German thrust and then counterattacking to expand the breakthrough that Cobra had created. The failure of the Mortain counteroffensive committed the last significant German mobile reserves to defensive battle, where they were destroyed through attrition, opening the way for Allied encirclement operations that would trap large German forces in what became known as the Falaise Pocket. Bradford observed that German decision to continue fighting rather than retreating when encirclement threatened reflected combination of Hitler's orders, forbidding withdrawal, and German commanders' assessment that retreat through Allied air power would be more costly than defending in place, but the result was catastrophic losses in personnel and equipment that destroyed German ability to conduct organized defense of France. The scenes of destruction in the Falaise area where German forces attempting to escape encirclement were caught by Allied aircraft and artillery demonstrated the terrible effectiveness of modern firepower against concentrated targets that lacked protection or maneuver space. Bradford visited the area after fighting moved east and observed the landscape covered with destroyed vehicles and dead soldiers and animals. The density of wreckage making movement difficult even for troops not under fire, and providing visceral evidence of what happened to military forces caught in the open without air cover or room to maneuver. The psychological impact of witnessing such complete destruction affected soldiers on both sides, with Allied troops feeling both satisfaction at the visible evidence of German defeat and horror at the scale of killing that modern weapons could inflict, while German survivors carried trauma of the experience that contributed to declining morale and increasing unwillingness to continue futile resistance. Bradford reflected that while the Normandy campaign had succeeded in establishing lodgment and breaking out into France, the human cost measured in tens of thousands of casualties on all sides represented tragedy that could never be fully justified even by military necessity of defeating Nazi Germany. The pursuit across France that followed the breakout from Normandy proceeded so rapidly that logistics rather than German resistance became primary constraint on Allied operations, with supply lines stretching hundreds of miles from Normandy beaches to forward units advancing faster than truck convoys could sustain with available resources. Bradford's intelligence work during this period focused less on German defensive capabilities than on assessing where German forces might establish new defensive lines and how quickly they could reconstitute combat power after catastrophic losses in Normandy. The intelligence picture showed German units in disarray with formations shattered and command structures disrupted. Thousands of German soldiers surrendering rather than continuing retreat that offered no prospect of successful defense, and equipment losses that could not be replaced, given Germany's deteriorating industrial situation under sustained Allied bombing. The optimism that these intelligence assessments generated led to predictions that war might end before 1944 concluded, if Allied forces could maintain pressure and prevent German forces from establishing stable defensive positions. But Bradford recognized that even shattered armies could reconstitute if given time, and that German forces would fight more desperately when defending their homeland than they had when defending occupied territories. The liberation of Paris in late August provided symbolic victory that captured public imagination more than the tactical success at Falaise or the rapid advances across France, with images of celebrating Parisians welcoming Allied troops, providing powerful propaganda contrast to the years of German occupation. Bradford participated in intelligence assessment of German decision to abandon Paris, rather than defending it and destroying city infrastructure as Hitler had ordered. The German commander's refusal to carry out demolition orders, reflecting either humanitarian concerns or recognition that defending Paris would serve no military purpose, while destroying the city would simply add to German war crimes without affecting campaign's outcome. The decision to allow French forces to liberate their own capital recognized political symbolism, while accepting temporary diversion of resources from military operations strictly focused on destroying German forces, Bradford's assessment being that the pause to liberate Paris was justified by political considerations, even though it allowed some German forces to escape that might otherwise have been captured or destroyed. The questions about how to proceed once Allied forces reached German borders involved debates about operational strategy that reflected different national priorities and military philosophies within the Allied coalition. British Field Marshal Montgomery advocated concentrating resources behind single thrust into northern Germany that would capture industrial Ruhr region and potentially end war quickly through driving to Berlin, while American commanders favored broad front advance that would maintain pressure across entire line and prevent German forces from concentrating against any single Allied attack. Bradford's intelligence input to these strategic debates emphasized that German forces retained capability to contest Allied operations despite their defeats in France, and that single-thrust strategy risked catastrophic failure if concentrated attack was stopped by German defenses, while broad front approach guaranteed continued pressure, even if it meant slower overall progress. The eventual adoption of broad front strategy reflected both military assessment of risks and political necessity of maintaining Allied unity by ensuring all national forces participated in final victory rather than having any single commander claim credit for defeating Germany. This moment at the hinge between Normandy's success and the final drive into Germany is when you realize that D-Day was not an end, but a beginning, not a single victory, but the opening of a campaign that would require months of additional fighting before final triumph. The intelligence operations and deception plans that made June 6th possible continued shaping the battle for France and would influence operations into Germany itself. Subscribe because this channel shows you how modern warfare actually works with intelligence and logistics, mattering as much as battlefield courage. Comment and tell us which intelligence operation or deception plan from any war most impresses you, and what future topics about military intelligence you want us to explore. Share your thoughts about whether deception and trickery in warfare are acceptable, or whether they cross ethical lines that should constrain military operations even against enemies like Nazi Germany. The autumn stall of Allied operations as supply lines stretched beyond sustainable capacity, and as German resistance stiffened along approaches to German homeland, demonstrated that the optimistic predictions of war ending in 1944 had underestimated German capacity to reconstitute defensive forces and to exploit advantages that defending homeland provided to forces fighting on interior lines. Bradford's intelligence assessments during September and October identified formation of new German units drawn from training establishments and rear area personnel. These hastily organized forces lacking the combat effectiveness of veteran divisions destroyed in France, but still capable of manning defensive positions and contesting Allied advances. The failure of Operation Market Garden in September, the ambitious airborne operation intended to seize bridges across Rhine and open route into northern Germany, demonstrated that German forces could still contest major Allied operations and inflict significant casualties when conditions favored defenders. Bradford's analysis of Market Garden suggested that operational concept was sound, but that execution suffered from over-optimism about German capabilities and from failure to adequately prepare for contingencies when initial plan did not unfold as expected. The lessons being that even weakened enemies remained dangerous and that complexity increased risk of operations that required multiple sequential objectives to be achieved for overall success. The intelligence preparation for winter operations focused on assessing German intentions and capabilities, as both sides recognized that weather would constrain large-scale offensive operations until spring, creating operational pause that would allow both sides to rebuild forces and prepare for renewed campaigning. Bradford monitored indicators of German activity that might suggest preparations for counteroffensive. The intelligence picture showing increased German train movements and communications activity in Ardennes sector that suggested buildup of forces in area that had been relatively quiet since Allied breakout from Normandy. The intelligence analysts debated whether observed activity indicated defensive reinforcement or preparation for offensive operations, with some arguing that Germans lacked resources for major counteroffensive, while others warned that desperation might drive German high command to attempt surprise attack similar to what they had achieved in 1940 when invading France through the Ardennes. Bradford's assessment leaned toward caution, based on his experience with German capacity for surprise and on understanding that Hitler's decision-making did not always follow rational military logic, but the consensus view among Allied intelligence was that German forces were too weak to mount serious offensive threat, and that observed activity represented defensive preparations. The German Ardennes offensive that erupted in mid-December caught Allied forces by surprise despite the intelligence indicators that Bradford and others had identified. The attack demonstrating that even thorough intelligence preparation could miss major enemy operations when deception and operational security prevented clear picture from emerging. Bradford's post-attack analysis identified multiple intelligence failures, including dismissal of reports from frontline units about increased German activity, underestimation of German willingness to commit strategic reserves to offensive operation when defensive needs were so great, and assumption that German logistics situation would prevent sustained offensive even if initial attack achieved surprise. The Ardennes offensive created temporary crisis before being contained by rapid American response that included movement of reserves to threatened sector and by weather improvement that allowed Allied air power to attack German supply lines and troop concentrations. The eventual defeat of the offensive destroying the last significant German strategic reserves and making subsequent Allied operations into Germany easier than they would have been if these forces had been available for defensive operations. Bradford's role during the Ardennes battle involved coordinating intelligence about German intentions and capabilities as the offensive developed, attempting to distinguish between what German forces were actually capable of achieving versus what their initial successes suggested might be possible if momentum continued. The intelligence picture clarified as the offensive progressed that German forces lacked fuel for sustained advance and that their logistics situation would force operational pause regardless of tactical successes achieved during initial attacks. This assessment allowing Allied commanders to focus on containing the penetration rather than conducting wholesale retreat that panic about German breakthrough might have prompted. The intelligence coordination also helped identify German objectives, including apparent intent to capture Antwerp and split Allied armies. Understanding German operational plan allowing Allied forces to position reserves to block key routes and prevent German achievement of strategic objectives even if tactical advances continued for several more days. The crossing of the Rhine in March 1945 represented final major obstacle to Allied advance into Germany's industrial heartland. The river barrier requiring extensive engineering preparation and force concentration to overcome German defenses that took advantage of water obstacle to create defensive line that should have been difficult to breach. Bradford's intelligence preparation for Rhine crossing operations identified German defensive positions and assessed which sectors offered best opportunities for achieving breaches before German reserves could counterattack. The analysis being complicated by German defensive doctrine that emphasized flexible response using mobile reserves rather than rigid linear defense. The successful crossing at Remagen, where American forces captured intact bridge before German demolition could be completed, demonstrated value of exploiting unexpected opportunities rather than waiting for carefully prepared operations. Though the methodical British crossing in northern sector showed that both approaches could succeed when properly executed with adequate resources. The advance into Germany following Rhine crossings proceeded more rapidly than defensive terrain, and German desperation to defend homeland might have predicted, with German defensive organization collapsing as Allied spearheads penetrated deep into rear areas, and as German soldiers increasingly chose surrender over continued resistance that served no rational purpose. Bradford's intelligence during final weeks of war in Europe focused on identifying remaining pockets of German resistance and on assessing whether Nazi leadership would attempt to organize final defensive stand in Alpine Redoubt that intelligence reports suggested was being prepared. The Alpine Redoubt proved to be more myth than reality. with German forces being too disorganized and lacking resources to establish coherent defensive position, despite propaganda claims about continuing resistance. But the intelligence concern about prolonged guerrilla warfare or last-ditch defense tied down Allied planning resources until actual occupation of supposed redoubt areas revealed the claims to be largely fabricated. The discovery of concentration camps by Allied forces advancing through Germany provided horrific confirmation of Nazi atrocities that intelligence services had been reporting, but that many observers had dismissed as exaggerated propaganda. Bradford visited several liberated camps and witnessed conditions that exceeded the worst intelligence estimates, the systematic extermination of millions, and the deliberately created conditions of slow death through starvation and disease, representing evil on scale that challenged comprehension. The evidence documented at these camps became foundation for war crimes prosecutions and provided moral justification for the war's costs that went beyond strategic or political considerations, demonstrating that defeating Nazi Germany had been moral imperative regardless of the tremendous sacrifices required. Bradford reflected that the intelligence about camps that had been available during the war should have prompted more urgent action to liberate them, though he recognized that military operations had to follow strategic logic rather than humanitarian priorities, and that earlier invasion attempts would likely have failed and thereby delayed liberation even longer. The final collapse of German resistance in May 1945 brought formal end to war in Europe, though scattered fighting continued in some areas where units had not received surrender orders, or where fanatical elements refused to accept defeat. Bradford's immediate post-surrender work involved processing captured German documents and interrogating German intelligence officers to understand what German intelligence services had known about Allied operations and whether deception efforts had been as successful as Allied assessments suggested. The interrogations revealed that Operation Fortitude had been remarkably effective, with German intelligence continuing to believe in existence of the fictional 1st U.S. Army Group well into summer of 1944. The commitment of German forces to defending Pas-de-Calais against expected second invasion having significantly contributed to Allied success in Normandy by preventing timely German reinforcement of actual invasion beaches. The German officers expressed professional respect for Allied deception operations, while maintaining that they had done their best with available information, their assessments having been shaped by intelligence that appeared credible across multiple sources, because Allied deception planners had successfully created consistent picture that confirmed German preconceptions rather than contradicting them. Bradford's post-war assignment involved documenting lessons learned from Operation Overlord for use in future military planning. The systematic analysis of what had worked and what had failed, providing foundation for evolution of amphibious operations, doctrine and intelligence practices. The assessment identified multiple factors contributing to Overlord's success, including the extended planning period that allowed identification and solution of problems before they occurred during actual operations, the commitment of resources to specialized equipment development that solved specific tactical challenges, the comprehensive deception operations that created strategic confusion preventing effective German response, and the overwhelming material superiority that Allied forces enjoyed in air power and logistics that allowed them to sustain operations despite German resistance. The analysis also identified failures and missed opportunities, including the intelligence underestimation of German defenses at Omaha Beach that contributed to high casualties there, the failure to capture Caen on D-Day as planned, which extended the campaign and increased overall casualties, and the logistics limitations that constrained operations during autumn 1944 and potentially allowed German forces to establish defensive positions that prolonged the war. The technological innovations that Overlord required and produced influenced military developments for decades after the war, with specialized equipment developed for beach assault operations finding applications in subsequent amphibious operations, and with coordination techniques between air, naval, and ground forces becoming models for joint operations doctrine. Bradford contributed to studies examining how technologies like the proximity fuse for anti-aircraft artillery and the Mulberry artificial harbors had affected operations, his analysis emphasizing that technological solutions were most valuable when they addressed clearly identified operational requirements, rather than when technology was pursued for its own sake, without reference to how it would be employed tactically. The artificial intelligence capabilities that began emerging in post-war period created new opportunities for intelligence analysis that Bradford found both promising and concerning, with automated processing of large data volumes offering capabilities that human analysts could not match, while raising questions about whether machines could capture contextual understanding and intuitive assessments that characterized human intelligence work at its best. The deception operations that had been central to Overlord's success created precedents and techniques that influenced Cold War intelligence operations, with understanding of how to manipulate enemy perceptions through controlled information, becoming important capability in strategic competition between NATO and Warsaw Pact. Bradford's expertise in deception made him valuable advisor for Cold War planning that examined how similar techniques might be employed to confuse Soviet intelligence about NATO capabilities and intentions. Though the existence of satellite reconnaissance and other technical collection methods made achieving the kind of comprehensive deception that Fortitude represented more difficult in era when overhead imagery could directly observe physical deployments rather than relying on agent reports and communications intercepts that could be controlled. The fundamental principles of exploiting enemy preconceptions and creating consistent deception narratives across multiple sources remained valid even as specific techniques had to adapt to changing intelligence collection capabilities. Bradford's teaching emphasizing that successful deception required understanding how target audience processed information and what cognitive biases could be exploited to make them see what deceivers wanted them to see rather than objective reality. The human cost of the Normandy campaign and subsequent operations across Western Europe was measured in hundreds of thousands of casualties on all sides, with each death representing individual tragedy and collective loss that statistics could never adequately capture. Bradford attended memorial services for fallen comrades and visited military cemeteries where thousands of white crosses marked graves of soldiers who had died liberating France and defeating Nazi Germany. The visual impact of row after row of identical markers providing powerful reminder of war's costs that abstract casualty figures failed to convey. The question of whether these sacrifices had been justified by the results achieved admitted no simple answer, with moral necessity of defeating Nazi evil balanced against the terrible price paid by individuals who died and by families who lost loved ones. Bradford's evolving perspective over decades following the war incorporated both pride in having contributed to victory over fascism and deep sadness about the human costs that victory required, his understanding being that both responses were valid and that holding them simultaneously reflected complexity of historical events that defied simple moral judgments. The preservation of historical memory about Operation Overlord through museums, memorials, and continuing scholarly study ensured that the invasion's lessons and sacrifices would remain known to subsequent generations who had no direct experience of World War II. Bradford participated in oral history projects and provided technical assistance to historians writing about intelligence and deception operations. His willingness to discuss both successes and failures, providing valuable perspectives that complemented official histories emphasizing accomplishments while acknowledging difficulties. The public commemoration of D-Day anniversaries brought Bradford back to Normandy beaches multiple times over the years, the peaceful tourist destination contrasting sharply with the violent battlefield he remembered from 1944. The transformation from war to peace, providing tangible evidence that the sacrifices had achieved lasting results, even though new conflicts and challenges meant that the world they had fought to create remained imperfect and contested. The assessment of Operation Overlord's strategic impact extended beyond immediate military success of establishing Allied foothold in Western Europe to encompass longer-term consequences, including post-war settlement and the division of Europe that emerged from wartime decisions about where Allied and Soviet forces would meet. Bradford's post-war intelligence work included analyzing how Overlord timing and success had affected the strategic balance between Western allies and Soviet Union, with earlier successful invasion potentially having allowed Western forces to advance further east before meeting Soviet forces advancing from opposite direction. The counterfactual questions about what might have happened if invasion had occurred earlier or if it had failed could never be definitively answered, but Bradford's analysis suggested that the timing that actually occurred represented optimal balance between readiness and strategic necessity, with earlier invasion likely failing due to inadequate preparation, while later invasion would have allowed even more territory to fall under Soviet control during the advance westward. The technological legacy of Overlord included not only specific equipment developments, but also broader understanding of how systematic research and development could produce military capabilities that did not exist when requirements were first identified. Bradford observed that the success of specialized equipment like Hobart's funnies and the Mulberry Harbors demonstrated value of investing resources in solving anticipated problems before operations began, rather than improvising solutions after problems were encountered in combat. The contrast with earlier operations where inadequate preparation led to much higher casualties, validating the comprehensive planning approach that characterized Overlord. The lesson that emerged from this analysis was that time invested in preparation generally reduced casualties and increased probability of success more than attempting operations before adequate preparation was complete, though the challenge remained identifying when preparation was sufficient versus when additional time would not produce proportional improvements and might allow enemy to strengthen defenses that would make operations more difficult when they finally occurred. The intelligence practices that evolved from Overlord experience emphasized importance of integrating information from multiple sources to create comprehensive assessment rather than relying on any single intelligence collection method. Bradford's teaching emphasized that photographic reconnaissance, signals intelligence, human intelligence from agents and resistance networks, and interrogation of prisoners each provided different perspectives that were most valuable when synthesized rather than evaluated independently. The creation of coordinated intelligence organizations that could perform this synthesis became priority for military establishments, recognizing that information advantage was becoming as important as material advantage in determining combat outcomes. The challenge of preventing intelligence organizations from developing their own institutional biases and from falling into groupthink that discouraged dissenting assessments remained ongoing concern, with Bradford advocating for structured analytical techniques that forced consideration of alternative interpretations and that made assumptions explicit rather than allowing them to shape assessments unconsciously. The deception operations that had contributed so significantly to Overlord's success created expectations that similar techniques could be employed in future conflicts, but Bradford cautioned that each operational context was unique and that attempting to replicate fortitude without understanding why it had succeeded and what specific conditions made it effective would likely fail. The elements that made fortitude successful included German preconceptions about Pas-de-Calais being most likely invasion site, Allied control over German intelligence networks in Britain that allowed manipulation of information flowing to German analysts, and extended time period that allowed deception to be established gradually rather than requiring German intelligence to accept sudden contradictions to their previous assessments. Future deception operations would need to identify equivalent vulnerabilities in target intelligence systems and exploit them through operations designed for specific context rather than attempting to copy techniques that had worked in different circumstances. The personal impact of his wartime service shaped Bradford's post-war career and his understanding of intelligence work's importance to national security, with his experience demonstrating that wars could be won or lost based on quality of intelligence preparation and on ability to deny enemy accurate intelligence about friendly capabilities and intentions. His commitment to developing next generation of intelligence professionals reflected belief that peace was maintained through strength, that included not only military capabilities, but also intelligence that allowed early warning of threats, and that provided decision-makers with accurate assessments of strategic situations. The Cold War context made intelligence increasingly important, as nuclear weapons meant that wars between major powers could not be fought without risking civilization-ending escalation, making intelligence about enemy capabilities and intentions essential for preventing miscalculations that could trigger conflicts nobody wanted. The ethical questions about intelligence work and deception operations that Bradford grappled with throughout his career involved tension between effectiveness and morality, with successful intelligence often requiring activities that violated normal ethical standards, including lying, manipulation, and exploitation of human vulnerabilities. Bradford's resolution of these tensions involved contextualizing intelligence activities within larger framework of just war theory that held that means were justified by ends when defending against existential threats like Nazi Germany, but that same activities might not be justified in contexts where threats were less clear or where alternative approaches might achieve objectives without compromising ethical principles. The challenge was maintaining ethical standards while operating in field where adversaries did not feel constrained by such considerations, creating situations where excessive scrupulousness could lead to defeat by less ethical opponents who exploited restraints that democratic societies imposed on their intelligence services. The commemoration of intelligence contributions to Allied victory occurred more quietly than celebration of combat achievements, with much of the intelligence work remaining classified for decades after the war, and with public recognition being limited by continuing security concerns about methods and sources that might be relevant to current operations. Bradford accepted this limitation while working to ensure that within military and intelligence communities, the lessons from Overlord intelligence operations were preserved and transmitted to future generations, who would face their own challenges requiring intelligence expertise. His memoirs, written late in life, provided some public documentation of the intelligence aspects of Overlord that could be discussed without compromising sources and methods, contributing to broader historical understanding of how the invasion succeeded and what role intelligence played in that success. The transition from wartime intelligence work to peacetime career involved adjustments that Bradford found both liberating and frustrating, with the intensity and clear purpose of wartime service giving way to more ambiguous peacetime missions, where success was harder to define and where bureaucratic constraints replaced the flexibility that wartime urgency had permitted. His immediate post-war work involved occupation duties in Germany, where intelligence services worked to identify and neutralize remaining Nazi organizations and to assess Soviet intentions as wartime alliance transformed into Cold War competition. The shift from fighting common enemy to competing with former ally happened gradually through 1945 and 1946 as tensions emerged over post-war settlement, and as Stalin's intentions regarding Eastern Europe became clear, Bradford's intelligence background making him valuable for assessing Soviet capabilities and intentions based on observed patterns of behavior and deployment of forces in occupied territories. The Berlin crisis of 1948, when Soviet forces blockaded western sectors of the city, provided early test of how Cold War conflicts would unfold, with intelligence playing a crucial role in assessing Soviet willingness to use force and in planning airlift operations that kept Berlin supplied without triggering military confrontation. Bradford's analysis of Soviet behavior during the crisis suggested that Stalin was testing Western resolve rather than preparing for military action, this assessment supporting decision to respond with airlift rather than attempting to force land corridors that might have led to shooting war. The successful resolution of Berlin crisis through sustained airlift operations demonstrated that conflicts could be won through determination and logistics rather than military force, validating approaches that minimized risk of escalation while achieving political objectives through demonstrating capability and commitment rather than through actual combat. The formation of NATO in 1949 reflected recognition that collective defense organization was necessary to deter Soviet expansion in Europe, with intelligence cooperation among member nations becoming an important aspect of alliance structure that allowed sharing of information about Soviet capabilities and intentions. Bradford participated in establishing intelligence coordination mechanisms that allowed national intelligence services to share information while protecting sensitive sources and methods. The challenge being to create sufficient trust among allies whose national interests sometimes diverged while maintaining security against penetration by Soviet intelligence services. The discovery of Soviet agents within Western intelligence services demonstrated that this balance was difficult to achieve, with cases like those of Philby and other Soviet moles revealing how thoroughly Soviet intelligence had penetrated Western organizations and creating paranoia about trustworthiness of information, sharing that damaged intelligence cooperation for years. The evolution of intelligence collection technologies during the 1950s and beyond transformed what was possible in gathering information about adversary capabilities, with reconnaissance satellites eventually providing overhead imagery that revealed deployments and installations that no amount of human intelligence could have documented. Bradford observed this technological revolution with mixture of enthusiasm for expanded capabilities and concern about over-reliance on technical collection that might lead to neglect of human intelligence that provided insights into intentions and decision-making processes that imagery could not reveal. His experience from Overlord, where combination of technical and human intelligence had been essential to success, informed his advocacy for balanced intelligence architecture that employed all available collection methods rather than assuming that any single approach could provide complete picture needed for sound strategic assessment. The application of lessons from Operation Overlord to Cold War planning involved adapting concepts developed for specific historical circumstances to very different strategic context, where nuclear weapons fundamentally altered calculations about military operations. The deception concepts that had been so successful at Normandy remained relevant, but required adaptation to environment where both sides possessed reconnaissance capabilities that made large-scale physical deception much more difficult to achieve, though deception about intentions and about capabilities of new weapon systems remained feasible through controlled information operations. Bradford's contributions to Cold War deception planning emphasized that fundamental principles of exploiting adversary cognitive biases and creating consistent narratives across multiple information sources remained valid, even though specific techniques needed to evolve to account for changing intelligence collection capabilities on both sides. The personal satisfaction that Bradford derived from his career came not from public recognition, which was limited given the classified nature of much of his work, but from knowledge that his contributions had made meaningful difference to outcomes that mattered for millions of people whose lives were affected by wars, and by the prevention of wars through effective deterrence. His mentoring of younger intelligence professionals provided opportunity to pass on lessons learned through decades of experience, helping next generation avoid repeating mistakes while encouraging them to innovate and adapt to changing circumstances rather than rigidly applying historical lessons to situations where conditions had changed. The balance between learning from history and recognizing that each situation was unique represented core challenge that Bradford emphasized in his teaching, warning against both ignoring historical experience and assuming that history would repeat itself in predictable ways. The retirement from active service that Bradford eventually embraced allowed time for reflection on his career and for contributing to historical documentation that would preserve knowledge of World War II intelligence operations for future generations. His memoirs focused on analytical approaches and on lessons that remained relevant rather than on operational details that might compromise continuing intelligence methods, the goal being to educate without revealing information that could benefit potential adversaries. The reception of his memoirs by both intelligence professionals and historians validated his belief that documenting intelligence history was important for understanding how wars were fought and won, with reviews praising his insights while respecting his discretion about sensitive matters that could not yet be publicly discussed. The continuing classification of some aspects of Overlord intelligence operations decades after the war ended frustrated Bradford's desire for complete historical record, but reflected legitimate concerns about protecting sources and methods that might still be exploitable if revealed. The final years of Bradford's life brought opportunities to participate in commemorative events, marking major anniversaries of D-Day and Operation Overlord, with ceremonies in Normandy bringing together veterans from all Allied nations who had participated in the invasion and liberation of Europe. Bradford found these gatherings emotionally complex, with pride in accomplishments mixed with sadness for those who had not survived, and with reflection on whether different approaches might have achieved similar results with fewer casualties. The French gratitude expressed at these commemorations provided validation that the liberation had been meaningful to those who had lived under occupation, and who remembered the arrival of Allied forces as a defining moment in their lives. Though Bradford was always conscious that liberation had come at tremendous cost, including deaths of French civilians caught in combat and devastation of French communities that had been battlefields. The evolution of public memory about World War II and Operation Overlord over decades following the war reflected changing cultural attitudes toward military service and toward war itself, with early post-war celebrations of military victory gradually incorporating more complex narratives that acknowledged costs while still honoring those who served. Bradford appreciated this evolution toward more nuanced remembrance that could recognize both necessity of defeating Nazi Germany and the terrible price that victory required. His own views having moved over years from relatively uncomplicated pride in accomplishment toward deeper understanding of war's human costs and questioning of whether some of those costs might have been avoided through different operational choices. The tension between honoring sacrifice by emphasizing accomplishment and honestly assessing whether all sacrifices had been necessary remained unresolved in Bradford's mind, reflecting genuine difficulty of evaluating historical events where counterfactuals could never be tested and where moral judgments depended on unprovable assumptions about what might have happened under different circumstances. The scholarly assessment of Operation Overlord's place in military history consistently identified the invasion as watershed operation that demonstrated how modern industrial powers could project force across water barriers when proper planning and overwhelming resources were applied to the problem. Bradford's contributions to this historical scholarship emphasized intelligence and deception aspects that had been underappreciated in early accounts focusing primarily on combat operations. His analysis showing how strategic deception had created conditions allowing tactical success by preventing timely German reinforcement of invasion beaches. The recognition that Overlord's success depended on integration of multiple capabilities, including intelligence, logistics, specialized equipment, and tactical execution, rather than on any single factor, reflected sophisticated understanding of modern warfare that Bradford tried to communicate to audiences who preferred simpler narratives, emphasizing individual heroism or technological superiority. The question of whether operations on scale and complexity of Overlord could be successfully executed in modern warfare with contemporary technologies remained subject of professional debate, with some analysts arguing that precision weapons and advanced surveillance would make large-scale amphibious assaults impossible, while others contended that new technologies would create different capabilities, allowing modified versions of amphibious operations. Bradford's perspective emphasized that fundamental operational requirements, including establishing lodgment against opposition, building up combat power faster than enemy could reinforce defenses, and achieving objectives before operational pause allowed enemy to reconstitute remained constant regardless of how specific technologies evolved. His analysis suggested that while tactics and equipment would necessarily adapt to current capabilities and threats, core principles of amphibious operations demonstrated at Normandy retained relevance for understanding how to project military power across barriers and how to plan complex joint operations, integrating multiple service capabilities toward common objectives. The personal legacy that Bradford left through his intelligence work and through his contributions to documenting and analyzing Operation Overlord extended across multiple dimensions, including immediate impact on invasion success, longer-term influence on intelligence practices and doctrine, and educational contributions that shaped how subsequent generations understood the role of intelligence in military operations. His modesty about personal contributions reflected understanding that complex operations like Overlord succeeded through efforts of thousands of individuals, each performing their assigned tasks effectively, with no single person being indispensable, though many made important contributions. The recognition he received from intelligence community through various honors and through respect of colleagues who had worked with him provided validation that his contributions had been meaningful, though Bradford always maintained that the true measure of success was operational outcome rather than individual recognition. The final assessment of what Operation Overlord had achieved and what it represented in broader sweep of 20th century history placed the invasion within context of total war between industrial powers, where economic capacity and organizational effectiveness proved as important as battlefield courage and tactical skill. Bradford's understanding was that Overlord succeeded because Allied nations had built overwhelming material superiority through industrial mobilization, had developed sophisticated intelligence capabilities that provided information advantage over German forces, and had created effective organizations that could plan and execute complex operations requiring coordination across multiple domains and national forces. The human factors, including courage of soldiers who stormed beaches and determination of commanders who made difficult decisions, remained essential, but these factors operated within framework of material and organizational advantages that made success possible when similar human qualities had failed in earlier operations, lacking adequate preparation and resources. The hope that Bradford expressed in his later years was that the lessons from World War II, including the intelligence and planning aspects of Operation Overlord, would contribute to preventing future wars through helping leaders understand costs of military conflict and through providing capabilities for early warning and deterrence that might prevent escalation to actual combat. His experience had taught him that wars were easier to start than to end, and that costs in human suffering always exceeded what planners anticipated, making prevention of war through effective deterrence and diplomacy preferable to achieving military victory regardless of how just the cause. The tension between maintaining military capabilities needed for effective deterrence and avoiding arms races that increased risks of war represented ongoing challenge that Bradford believed could only be managed rather than definitively solved, requiring constant vigilance and wise leadership, willing to accept ambiguity and to resist simplistic solutions to complex strategic problems. The commemoration of Bradford's own contributions to Allied victory came through quiet recognition within intelligence community rather than public celebration, reflecting the secretive nature of intelligence work and his own preference for avoiding spotlight. His passing in the late 1990s removed another direct connection to World War II generation, though his documented insights and the professionals he had mentored ensured that his influence would continue shaping intelligence practices and understanding of how operations like Overlord succeeded through integration of intelligence with operational planning and execution. The ongoing relevance of the principles he had helped establish demonstrated that while technologies and specific circumstances changed continuously, fundamental requirements for effective intelligence in support of military operations remained constant across generations and conflicts.